Today, December 21st, 3i Atlas passed by Earth so close that even the most laid-back people scrambled to check their ephemerids for the first time. The event itself is rare, almost impossible, but the strange thing isn't the distance. The strange thing is how it chose that distance. You've seen those beautiful animations where a comet just flies by and disappears. It's a convenient image for the news. Everything is smooth, neat, and safe, but if you open the actual JPL tables, there's no beautiful arc. There's a narrow corridor, and it looks like it was picked up. After the convergence, the ephemeris was updated and a new layer appeared on the graph. Not large, not dramatic. A subtle correction like a pencil over a drawing. In numbers, this represents hundreds of thousands of kilometers. In the dynamics of the system, this is choice, not noise. The trajectory itself began to resemble not a flyby, but a detour. Not in and out, but rounded. As if the object wasn't rushing closer at any cost, nor was it flying away as quickly as possible. It was keeping its distance where Earth became the most convenient target for observation. Not hit, not capture, not explode, just observe. This is more frightening because it doesn't sound like a catastrophe. It sounds like an experiment, and in this experiment, you're not a spectator. You're an object on the table. There's a zone where the Earth is especially bright for radar, not by the naked eye, but by the iron. It's there where our radars, communications, millions of transmitters, satellites, reflective surfaces, and the noise of our entire civilization combine to form a vast beacon. Atlas passed as if it had chosen this very geometry. The paradox is that in the sky it looks modest, a faint dot, a faint glow, not even much of a show. But in the data, it behaves like something that understands our weak spots. And it understands the difference between we look pretty and we look accurately. Internally, we've started calling it perimeter. Unofficially, of course. A perimeter is when an object doesn't move in a straight line, but rather appears to skirt a boundary, and this boundary doesn't coincide with gravity. It coincides with our sensitivity. JPL sent back the covariance data, and it didn't have the usual probability cloud spreading out in all directions. It stretched along a single corridor. It didn't expand over time, but contracted, as if the system were adjusting itself. You don't like that, even if you don't like space. We tried to explain it in the standard way. Anisotropic outgassing, microjets, an asymmetric coma, all the usual stuff. But with ordinary comets, these things leave traces. They're visible in the spectra, in the shape of the coma, in the pulsations and brightness. But here, the traces were too neat. The most disturbing detail emerged when we superimposed the trajectory on a map of our observations. We looked at where the large radar beams were, where the windows of major observatories were, where the DSN traffic was, and it turned out that the flyby coincided with how we ourselves shine into space, not in the sense of sending messages to aliens, but in the sense of the normal functioning of a planet swathed in electronics. We're never silent for a second. We're constantly making noise, and Atlas moved as if it were important to hit the loudest sector. Then someone suggested something simple, a simple test. If we suspect an object is adapting to observation, let's remove the observation. Not by turning off everything on Earth, but at least create a blind graph for telescopes. This idea sounds strange because we usually do the opposite. The closer the object, the more telescopes we attach to it. But here we wanted to understand, is it responding to physics or to our coordination? If the latter, it should notice the very fact that we've adjusted our alignment. We assembled a network. It wasn't just NASA. We brought in Europeans, Japanese, and well-calibrated private companies. Keck, VLT, Subaru, several radio arrays, and whoever could. We created 2 schedules. One open, as always. The second closed, blind, with windows where no one is watching. And most importantly, a blind schedule didn't mean we weren't recording anything at all. We simply weren't aiming the primary instruments at Atlas at certain moments. We eliminated synchronicity. We eliminated that collective view that makes us a unified system. Nothing happened for the first hour. It was even a bit of a shame. You sit there and think, well, we just got ourselves worked up, but in reality, it's just an ordinary comet, just a rare one. And you almost want to return to the familiar world, where everything is explained by words like error and dust, and then the coincidence statistics were restructured. It didn't disappear, it didn't fall apart, it didn't die, as it should have if we were catching a coincidence. It simply changed form, as if the object weren't tied to our schedule, but read the very fact of our schedule. And when we turned off our synchronized gaze, it switched to something else. At first, we noticed it in small details. Where a data spike had previously coincided with a precise targeting window, it now appeared nearby, in a new location we weren't looking at. A shift of minutes, tens of minutes, just enough to make it look like a response, not a glitch. Things got worse. During blind windows, when the telescopes were silent, background systems began to behave as if someone was making noise. Not loud, not alarming, but enough to leave a thin needle-like mark in the logs. You might say, so we create these artifacts ourselves? We're human after all. But what was important in this test was that independent stations scattered across the planet saw the same thing. Not just one sensor, not just one team. Several at once, using different methods. We tried to be honest. We did a control run. We took old patches of sky where there was no object and repeated the blind plot there. There was no restructuring, no needles, no response. Just the normal boredom of nature you're used to. And then the room became quiet. Because while the perimeter flyby was geometry within our capabilities, the blind graph revealed something else. The object doesn't need us to look at it directly. It needs us to be a system, to synchronize, to acknowledge the fact of observation. And if he can read this fact, then the next step is obvious and very unpleasant. He can choose not only the trajectory, he can choose the moment. He can choose exactly when we look and what exactly we are ready to see at that moment. At the end of my shift, I caught myself thinking something that usually makes people laugh, that we'd conducted a test, as if we were testing something living, as if we were testing not stone and ice, but behavior. And the scariest thing is, the test worked. We turned off our eyes, but he didn't disappear. He just changed the angle at which he was shown. During the first blind window, we turned off not curiosity, but ritual. We eliminated that very moment when hundreds of people around the world simultaneously press start, and the sky turns into a single, shared instrument. And right in that window, Atlas did something that made my stomach clench. You'd expect that if an object responds to attention, it would quiet down when it's not. It's logical, right? No audience, no performance. But with Atlas, it was the other way around, as if the lack of gaze were also a signal, as if we'd pressed the test mode button. First came the optics, not direct Atlas observations, but control stars, those very anchors by which we check that the system hasn't drifted. And suddenly these anchors started drifting, not at the level of, the atmosphere, at the level of microscopic shifts, identical across different telescopes. We've covered all the standard causes: turbulence, humidity, temperature gradients in the domes, clock drift, poor tracking. But when two instruments on different continents show the same thing at the same minute, you're left with only one option. It's not inside the telescope. Then the radio amateurs joined in, and that's when things got really nasty. Their equipment is inferior, but there are a lot of them. They don't coordinate schedules, they don't know about blind spots, and they don't share the same correspondence. And that's precisely why their coincidences seem more honest than any article. At the same moment when the perimeter was being passed without our big eyes, short directional pulses appeared in the airwaves. Not an alien signal, not a melody, not numbers. Simply pulses, as if someone were testing how the wave was propagating through our environment. This in itself could have been attributed to terrestrial debris, military equipment, satellites, reflections, 1,000 commonplace sources, but the pulses were coming from the sector where, according to calculations, ATLAS was located, and their frequency was repeated in the window structure. At that moment, I realized for the first time that perimeter flyby wasn't just a trajectory image. It was a set of positions from which to highlight us in a way that we wouldn't notice as an attack, but would instead notice as an oddity. The difference was subtle, but it made all the difference. When we look directly, we expect to see traces of cometary physics, gas, dust, spectral lines, brightness variations. When we don't look directly, we begin to see things we don't usually see: infrastructure reactions, parasitic effects, synchronization breakdowns. And it seemed that's exactly what Atlas wanted. Not for us to take a pretty photo, but for us to see our own electrical shell as part of an experiment. We ourselves became a sensor, and that's worse than any bright tail in the sky. By the evening of the blind day, a report arrived from a team that shouldn't have been involved in this story at all. They were involved in satellite geodesy. Their job is to measure the Earth using signals, like a ruler, and they saw a brief tremor in the decisions. It wasn't everything went down, or the world collapsed. The models simply deteriorated for a few minutes, positions fluctuated, time synchronization was transferred to backup sources. It looked boring in the report, but for me, it was like a click, because it coincided with that same eyeless window. We weren't looking at Atlas, but it seemed to be looking back at us, And unlike those beautiful astronomical images, the reaction here was measured in our reality. We compiled all the timestamps into a single layer, optical data based on reference stars, radio pulses, geodesy, and then we superimposed the object's position in this corridor. The matches weren't perfect, as if someone was trying not to be perfect. That's the real horror, when a pattern looks neat enough to be intentional, yet messy enough that any expert would say, well, that's just noise. And you realize that this mess might be part of the design. Then something happened that usually gets written down in one line in reports but lives in your head for months. In the blind window, Atlas changed color. Not like in a movie, not in a flash. Gradually, but surely. The green faded. A warm golden hue appeared. Officially, this can be explained. The green glow is often associated with C2 molecules. The golden glow could be dust, sodium, a change in the composition of the coma, the phase of illumination, anything. But the problem was something else. It was the coincidence with our perestroika. When you set up a blind window, you expect data degradation, you expect chaos. But what you get here isn't chaos, but a new layer. The object's behavior changes, and this behavior is due to the fact that we're not viewing things in sync. Hubble confirmed the hue change independently. This is important, because it's hard to argue with Hubble. There's less of Earth's dirt there. And yes, I know, Hubble doesn't see color by eye. It uses filters, calibrations, and processing. But that's precisely why the result is so difficult. We quickly compared this with the observation angles, the sun's position, the phase, the scattering geometry, and we discovered something unpleasant. The golden component was enhanced where the object was least visible to Earth-based optical systems, but best seen in radio noise. That is, he became visible where we least expected him. It was as if he were changing the channel, as if he were saying, if you want a comet, you'll get a comet. If you want physics, you'll get physics. And if you turn off your eyes, I'll go where you're loudest. I looked at the trajectory map and thought about something simple. If this isn't an approach, but a flyby, then the flybys have a logic. They're collecting a profile. They're mapping the perimeter. They're looking for weak spots. They're checking how the object responds to surveillance modes. And the nastiest thing is that it can be described without the word intelligence. You don't even need to say controlled. It's enough to say system. A system that optimizes. A system that uses geometry and our own schedules as input. The next day, we decided to do something we don't usually do publicly. We changed the coordination not by time, but by meaning. We kept the tools enabled, but separated them by tasks so that the overall grid of observation disappeared. And here came the part that made even the most cynical people in the room tremble. Because Atlas wasn't just reacting, it was anticipating. And it was doing so as if it were reading not our schedule, but the very fact of our agreement. We pretended to remain in formation, but inside, we'd broken the common grid. We didn't turn off the telescopes, we didn't close the domes, we didn't maintain silence. We simply stopped looking with one gaze, in one rhythm, as a single organism. Usually, coordination leads to clarity. You sync windows, align calibrations, remove systematics, and the picture becomes more honest. We did the opposite. We deliberately introduced human chaos to verify what exactly Atlas sees. The first result seemed almost mockingly calm. The optics showed normal movement. The radio lines were smooth, no hysteria. I already caught myself thinking that we'd gone too far, that we'd invented a monster ourselves and were chasing it using the charts. And then the coincidences didn't disappear. They reorganized. They didn't disappear, didn't decrease, didn't dissolve into the noise. They simply moved to other channels as if the object said, okay, you've blown your eyes out, then I'll work through your nervous system. When Keck switched to long exposures on control stars and the VLT focused on spectra, short pulses began appearing on the radio in the same window. Not too strong, not loud enough to shout about themselves, just enough to be noticed by anyone who was already skeptical. At that moment, Subaru wasn't even looking at the object, but at the background galaxies to check for a floating field. And it was there that something strange emerged, a minimal but consistent change in the shape of the PSF, as if the optics were detecting not airborne impurities, but a slight inhomogeneity in the light path. You might say atmosphere. Everything is atmosphere. And I would agree if it were on the same telescope. But at the same moment, a similar trace was shown by another instrument in the other hemisphere. Different atmospheres, different domes, the same flavor. We went further and did something managers usually dislike. We separated people from their schedules. Different groups were given different observation cover stories so that no one could piece together the overall picture from the inside. If the subject responded to the schedule, it was supposed to go blind. The effect was almost humiliating. Even when people didn't know what others were doing, the coincidence statistics continued to stack up, as if someone were viewing the entire system from above. as if they weren't reading our emails, but the very fact that we exist as a network. The most severe issue came from a simple source: time. Not time of day, not dates, but time as a precision. At several stations, the reference phases were out of sync, at a level that doesn't disrupt the work, but forces the engineer to recalculate everything. Such things are usually chalked up to drift and the ticket closed. But when you're already hooked on coincidences, drift becomes words from another life. Because drift also has a structure. And this structure, unfortunately, once again coincided with the Atlas sector. An unpleasant realization was growing inside me. He chooses when we look. It's not about our eyes. It's about our composure. About the moment when humanity becomes a single device, even if we don't believe it and pretend that everyone is on their own. I plugged a simple question into the model. If a trajectory is a perimeter flyby, then what is the perimeter? Not geographical, not atmospheric. The perimeter of our visibility, the perimeter of how far our noise, our communications, our beams and reflections travel. And then the picture became too clear to be pleasant. Earth has not only a gravity well, but also a radiosphere. We glow, we emit, we reflect. We pulse with satellite and radar schedules like a heartbeat. If you want to passively film the planet, you don't necessarily look at its oceans. You listen to its grid. You listen to how it services itself. Where are its bottlenecks? Where is the redundancy? Where is the surge? Where is the silence? And Atlas seemed to be doing just that. It wasn't approaching for the sake of beauty. It was avoiding those areas where the Earth is most effective as a target for radar and passive imaging. It was moving in a way that allowed it to see us through our own instruments without directly threatening us. Hubble confirmed the golden component at precisely the moment when our ground-based network was losing synchronization. This was more nerve-wracking than any schedule, because Hubble has its own rhythm, its own logic, and it doesn't participate in our games. We tried to explain it with normal physics. Dust fraction, sodium, scattering geometry, changes in the coma. Everything can be described neatly, without mysticism. The only problem was, why does all this stop at the moments of our coordination? At a meeting, someone said something that first sounded like a joke, but then became a diagnosis. We're trying to catch a comet, but what we're catching is a reflection of our own organization. No one laughed because it was too close. That same day, a short report came in from people who look at Earth, not space. The ionosphere was acting strange again. Not a catastrophe, not a storm. A small, careful shift in reflection in the bands where our communications and navigation operate. It was as if someone was pinging our shell, looking at how deep the waves traveled, how they reflected, where the dips were, where the amplifications were, and they weren't doing it with a powerful blow, but with a barely audible touch, so we'd argue among ourselves. The most frustrating thing about stories like these is that they don't provide a clear point where you can say, this is it. They spread the anxiety thinly, and each individual piece can be thrown into the trash. But when you put them together, you realize that the trash forms a map. We raised ALMA again, although officially it was just a routine molecular composition check, and that's where a line emerged that shouldn't have been so stable. It was too straight, like a nail, and it was precisely the straightness that made it dangerous. The operator said something simple. If it's a molecule, it should breathe differently. I looked at the graph and saw that the line was breathing, but not like chemistry. It was breathing in time with our orbits, our switches, our observation modes. This is where the phrase, "he chooses when we watch," became difficult. Not because anyone recognized intelligence, but because a sense of feedback emerged. We changed the mode, and after a while, we see the response change, like a system that listens to input and produces output. I caught myself thinking that we're no longer discussing what Atlas is. We're discussing what we are. For the first time, we saw ourselves as a bustling, connected, synchronous planet, and if someone is passing by and wants to measure civilization, this is the perfect way. After that, we made a decision we usually only make when it's too late. We agreed on one last test, not a blind window or a schedule break. We decided to briefly turn off the loudest part of our network as much as possible. If Atlas really was reading us through our connectivity, that should have changed the picture. And if the picture changed, we wouldn't have proof, but a reason to stop pretending we were just looking at a pretty comet. It wasn't about the comet anymore. Then came a moment I still remember like a chill in my fingers. Because when we took that quiet step, we got the answer in a different place than we expected. We thought it would get quieter, but it became more precise. And that was precisely what became the most terrifying. We couldn't turn off the planet. That's a myth. But we could do something else. Temporarily remove predictability. Remove the loudest spotlights from the sky, the ones we direct ourselves, and see what remains in the darkness. The test looked boring on paper. Several communication stations switched to backup frequencies. A couple of radars reduced their power. Several synchronization networks switched to autonomous time generators. No panic, just a quiet rearrangement. The implication was clear. If Atlas is oriented toward our choir, it should lose its bearings for a second. It's not that we should see it worse, but that it should see us less clearly. And if this is true, there will be a gap in the data, a breakdown of coincidences, a spreading of lines. The first few minutes felt like victory. The graphs seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Alma showed a decline in that very pin line. The optics became clear without any strange microshifts. For a second, it even felt like we'd finally caught up with common sense, and then it got worse than before. Not louder, not brighter, more precisely. It was as if the object had stopped listening to the general noise and switched to what we couldn't muffle. Geometry. The very structure of how we move around the sun. The line didn't disappear from the spectrum, it narrowed. Whereas before it looked like a strange signal amidst the noise, it now resembled a pinpoint, honed to the extreme. And the most disturbing thing, it began appearing not according to the observation schedule, but according to orbital events. When mid-range satellites pass the nodes where their orbits flip relative to the Sun-Earth line, the line took a small breath. When geostationary platforms passed their stable points, the line responded with a kind of echo. It was like when someone stops listening to the crowd and starts reading their heartbeat. You can ask for silence, you can turn down the music, but your heartbeat still gives you away. We turned off the music. Atlas heard the heart. I opened the timestamp table and felt irritated, almost angry. Because the coincidences weren't with our decisions, but with things we couldn't control. With the moon, with the Earth's rotation, with repeatable geometry windows that we can't rewrite. At that moment, it became clear why the trajectory looked like a perimeter flyby. Perimeter isn't a distance, it's a level of information. He was circling us in a way that maximized the connectivity of our world, but without entering the harsh danger zone. That's why he didn't attack us. A blow destroys the object of study, but here he needed a working sample. He needed the infrastructure in good working order to map it. If so, then our test wasn't a threat to him, but a clue. Immediately after the quiet window, something usually buried in report surfaced at several ground stations. Brief dips in phase stability. Not accidents, not outages. Such dips are only visible to those who measure the world down to the micron. One engineer wrote me briefly, "It looks like an external reference." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. Then he clarified, "The oscillations look like the system is trying to synchronize with something other than our own time. It sounds too good to be true, but the numbers were more stubborn than words." In those moments when we became quieter, our instruments didn't just calm down. They seemed to become more sensitive to the alien support that had previously been hidden in our noise. I caught myself thinking that we're acting like an island that's seen a tidal wave for the first time and is debating whether the ocean even exists. We're arguing about sensors, but around us there might simply be a different scale of physics, where our norms are merely local habits. And then color resurfaced. Hubble delivered another burst. The golden component intensified over a short interval, coinciding with the cleanest moment in our grid. Not when we looked more, but when we interfered less. It was more terrifying than any maneuver. The maneuver could be explained by gas, asymmetry, theory, and the color matching our connectivity seemed like the answer. Not a random side effect, but a careful choice of mode, noticeable to us. Someone in the room said, "He chooses not when we look, but when we can understand." This sounds like mysticism, but translated into normal language, it means something different. He chooses windows of maximum observability, where our instruments are aligned. We try to translate all of this back into physics. Dust fractions alter scattering. The composition of the coma changes with illumination. The geometry of the phase angle affects hue. All true, but none of this truth explained synchronization with our network. Then Tom did something simple. He superimposed the trajectory on a map of the Earth's observation perimeter. Not based on telescopes, but on radio emission density. Based on the zones where our planet is loudest, and on the corridors where it resonates with pure harmonics. And the trajectory fell into place like a key in a lock. Not perfect, not mathematically beautiful, but enough to silence even those who like to laugh at patterns. There were too many coincidences to continue playing blind. The hardest part of this picture is that it doesn't require intelligence. It's enough for the object to be a system that can measure and adapt. This could be nature, but then nature would behave as if it were an engineer. By evening, another signal arrived, the most unpleasant, precisely because of its mundane form. Positioning errors had surfaced again on several aviation routes. Small things, seconds, meters, but meters that coincided with yet another node in the trajectory. You might say it was a coincidence, and I would have said that a year ago, but now every coincidence felt like a cut along a nerve because the coincidences weren't chaotic. They had favorite points, favorite windows, favorite rhythms. We began to understand why the flyby looked so neat. It wasn't circling the Earth like a satellite. It was circling the zones where we are most visible as a civilization. Radar, communications, astrometry, calibrations, all the things we use to measure space. And here's where the scenario becomes truly terrifying. If this is a perimeter flyby, then the next step is logical. Blind spot flyby. Testing what we can't see, testing what we can't measure, and that's no longer about a graceful flyby. Last night, I rewatched the first seconds, when we still considered it just a rare visitor. Everything seemed innocent then. The green glow, the infographics, the safe distance. Now it seemed like a mask we ourselves had put on to cover what was happening. And the most disturbing thing, the mask worked. Millions of people looked at the sky and saw a dot, and we looked at the data and saw a process. The difference was that the dot would go away, but the process, once it had begun, could return. At dawn, a message arrived from a colleague in another group. Briefly and without emotion, if this is a perimeter walk, then there must be a subsequent loop. And below it, a calculation of where this loop might be after the current section. I read it and felt a chill. Because the next loop wasn't happening in a beautiful place for astronomy. It was happening where our network is densest, where we live, where we can't switch off, even for a minute. On paper, the next loop looked like nothing. Just a minor tweak to the ephemeris, a tiny kink in the tail of the hyperbola that any student would have chalked up to a data refinement. But if you've seen Atlas select windows, this nothing sounds like a step. Tom wasn't trying to be dramatic. He simply showed me two curves superimposed on each other. One was how the object should move if everything were random. The second was how it moves based on the new solutions. The difference was subtle, but the direction of the difference was all too familiar. This isn't a departure, he said. This is a repassage through the informational zone. Not closer to Earth in distance, but closer in meaning. He's reaching again for the corridors where we shout and measure simultaneously, where our perimeter is densest. The most alarming thing is that this behavior doesn't require a second maneuver. The first is enough. That Martian adjustment, which we still haven't been able to explain honestly, is enough. It laid everything else like dominoes. Once you've hit the right phase space corridor, you can simply use natural resonances from now on. Like a surfer who's caught a wave and then just maintains balance. And now it felt like Atlas was precisely maintaining balance. We tried again what common sense usually does. Separate everything into independent channels, fiber optics separately, radio separately, plasma separately, navigation separately, and see where the noise was out of sync. At first, it seemed like the plan was working, but then we noticed something worse than synchronization, restructuring. The coincidences didn't disappear, they changed form. It was as if the object weren't tied to our schedule, but were reading the very fact of our coordination. This was the moment when the phrase, "he chooses when we look," ceased to be a metaphor. Because we were observing not coincidences with specific telescopes, but coincidences with the system's mode, with the moment when the world becomes a single instrument. The clearest example came not from NASA, but from ground-based observers. A group of amateur observers of Atlas from various countries suddenly discovered the same strange effect in the photometry. Not brightness, not a tail, a slight trembling of color. They didn't know about our internal reports. They simply posted graphs, flat dots, and then, suddenly, short steps. Those steps coincided with our quiet window, when we were trying to eliminate predictability. And this wasn't just about the instruments, it was about a phenomenon that manifests itself at all levels, from an amateur camera to a millimeter wave array. It was as if Atlas was leaving a mark on the observed signal itself, not just on our interpretation. That same day, Hubble sent a clarification on the spectrum. The golden component wasn't simply intensifying, it was stable, longer than it should have been. In conventional models, the hue fluctuates with geometry and composition. Here, it held true, like the selected mode. I understand how that sounds, but when you see stability in the wrong place, you stop arguing with language. You start arguing with mathematics. And this time, mathematics was against our comfort. We returned to the trajectory. And there was a second eerie detail. The section after the approach looked like a detour, photographing the Earth in profile. Not the surface, but the shell, based on how the planet appears in the radio spectrum and in reflections. So he didn't just pass by. He passed by in such a way as to see us not as a sphere, but as a system, as a network, as a pattern. This is what perimeter patrol means. You're not patrolling the city, but its alarm system. Lynn said quietly, "If I were designing a passive reconnaissance mission for the technosphere, this is exactly what I'd do. Don't enter dangerous zones, don't scare, don't leave traces, just go through the motions with maximum information." We debated whether it was even possible to think like that, because this is no longer an anomalous object, it's already a scenario. And the most dangerous thing in science is when you start seeing scenarios where there should only be probabilities. But then a report arrived that left no room for the usual cynicism. Several radio telescopes had picked up a directional pulse from the sector where, according to the Ephemeris, ATLAS was located. Not an alien signal, just a pulse. Smooth, narrow, and simultaneously, several communications and surveillance satellites lost signal for the same amount of time, then returned. Not a massive failure, not a cascade, too clean, too synchronized. It looked like an infrastructure impact test. Once again, it could have been a coincidence, it could have been an earthly source, it could have been anything. But it coincided not just in timing, but in meaning. A pulse from the object's sector and a brief blindness in our networks. If you want to test a civilization, you don't hit it. You poke at its fine threads and see how it reacts. You measure its resilience, its reserves, its redundancy, its self-healing. We saw exactly that. And then, within the team, the very word everyone had been avoiding began to ring out: interaction. Not observation, not effect, but interaction, because observation is when an object behaves independently of us. Here, independence seemed dubious. The only thing that saved us was that nothing was happening outwardly. No outbreaks, no catastrophes. Atlas was leaving, and the world considered the story closed. This allowed us to think without having to explain ourselves out loud, but inside, it felt like only a window had been closed. Not an episode, a window, as if Atlas had watched, recorded, verified. And now, as he left us not an answer, but a question. Do you even understand what you can radiate about yourself? That night, I opened the perimeter map again, and I saw another layer, one we'd previously ignored because it was too human. Our observation schedules, our synchronized campaigns, our blind graphs, and this layer contained the most vile logic. When we stopped looking, the coincidences didn't disappear. They reorganized themselves around the fact that we'd stopped looking, as if the object was reacting not to the telescope, but to the solution itself. This makes you helpless, because you can't outsmart what's reading your coordination. Any attempt to hide becomes data. Any attempt to observe becomes data. You're in an experiment and you can't escape. In the early morning, a short message arrived from a man who usually posts dryly and infrequently. If we're right, the next event won't be in the sky. It'll be in the channels. Watch DSN. I watched the DSN, and I saw something that made me physically feel fear for the first time. In the distant channels, in the telemetry of the deep space vehicles, a thin, barely noticeable repetition appeared. Not noise, not interference. A repetition. It was as if someone had taken our packet, held it for a split second, and then returned it, almost without distortion. Not a reflection from a planet, not from the moon. Geometry-wise, it was from a cone, the apex of which coincided with Atlas's current position. This wasn't a signal of from there, it was our signal, returned to us. A test of how we communicate with the distant edge, a test of how far our wires extend. And at that moment, I understood why gold, instead of green, felt like a mark. Gold isn't just a color, it's a visual signature. We're here, and we can change our visibility so you'll notice. Atlas was leaving, but it wasn't leaving like a stone. It was leaving as someone who had completed a stage. And if this is true, then the next stage might not come from the other side of the world, but from the same pattern, from the same logic, where the first flight was a calibration. One part remains. Part 6/6 should close the loop tightly. What we realized after leaving, why the perimeter flyby turned out to be only the first map, and what the most terrifying conclusion the dataset left us with. The morning after the flyby, everything seemed humiliatingly ordinary. The news quickly moved on, the memes fizzled out, and amateur chats debated why the comet had seemed dim in person. Only in our logs did something remain that couldn't be unseen. Atlas was moving away, but the coincidences didn't fade. They changed shape like echoes in a room where you rearrange the furniture. We expected that after closest approach, the anomalies would dissipate because the main factor would disappear. But the main factor, it seems, wasn't distance. The main factor was our reaction, our synchronicity, our networks, our observation modes, the way civilization was becoming a single sensory organ, and that was the most vile discovery because there was no hiding from it. The first report that bruised my ego came from someone who hadn't worked on comets at all. A team analyzing time stability in distributed systems noticed short bursts of misalignment. It wasn't that the clocks had broken, but that the distribution tails had grown. And these tails fell in the same windows where DSN picked up packet repeats, where ALMA saw its needle, where GPS produced tremors. In other words, it wasn't just one area of physics, but several that began to sing along with each other. Randomness can create noise. Randomness can create a strange line in a single range. But for different systems to simultaneously exhibit similar tails, a common cause is needed. And once again, we've run into something we didn't want to say. Inside the archive, which no one officially acknowledged, a new folder appeared. Not anomalies, not correlations. It had a worse name, pattern stability, because now we were checking not facts, but form. If the shape is repeated, you might misinterpret it, but you can't pretend it doesn't exist. We ran a simple test. We stripped the flight time from the data and compared the before and after results. And what emerged was something I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it myself. After the flyby, some of the effects didn't disappear, but moved to other reference points. It was as if the system had reorganized where to press to get the same type of response. This was the moment when the idea that the object is reading our coordination ceased to be just a feeling. It became a working hypothesis, not for a press release, for the survival of common sense within the team. We tried to play fair and do something more terrifying than any mysticism. Reduce everything to physics? We constructed models of the maximally natural explanation and smashed them against each other like rocks. Anisotropic gas evolution requires perfect directionality without spectral signatures. Electromagnetic effects require energy and a mechanism that must leave imprints on the plasma. Gravitational effects require mass or geometry. Any single channel can be written off, but when you try to explain everything at once, you start to force the world to suit your convenience, and that's where we first took the step that would later haunt us. Tom proposed not to explain Atlas, but to answer a different question. What minimal structure must exist to yield such correlations? Not what it is, but what class of objects is capable of this. We took the flyby parameters and ran an inversion. Not a mass-based trajectory, but an observational influence. The computer spat out garbage until we added one thing that no normal person would add to a comet problem. Not force, not mass, but a local correction to the metric. A thin sleeve of modified geometry that moves with the object, not constant, but adaptive, reacting to the environment. When the model first converged, the room became so quiet you could hear a wire trembling somewhere. Because with such a sleeve, many things suddenly became simple. Back then, the perimeter flyby was explained not as a clever choice of trajectory, but as a configuration in which the arm would provide maximum information about the network around Earth. Then the needle in the spectrum might not have been a molecule, but a regime marker. Back then, the echo in the DSN didn't seem like magic, but rather a side effect of interacting with communication channels at the edge of sensitivity. Back then, even our blind graphs became data, because the system reacted to the very fact of our synchronization. And the most disgusting thing, this model didn't require enormous energies. It required a different type of control. Control not over momentum, but over how space behaves in a small volume. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's the bare minimum required for our inconsistencies to cease being a dozen separate nightmares and become one seamless whole. We didn't show this file to anyone except a few people who don't laugh. It had a dry title, but inside was a phrase I remember verbatim. Object behaves as if it carries its own measurement environment. So it's not just flying, it's carrying with it a laboratory in which we become a model. And if that's true, then the worst thing happened not on December 19th, but when our world unanimously looked at it. Without realizing it, we'd built the perfect target ourselves. We'd surrounded the planet with a network that radiates, measures, synchronizes, and backs up. We'd done everything we could to ensure that any outside analyst understood. This is the level of civilization. This is its noise. This is its limits. And Atlas was designed to see this in profile, to see not the Earth, but the technosphere, to understand what we can do, where we're blind, and how quickly we can connect different sensors into a single brain. While we were arguing about the golden hue, a more terrifying fact lay in the mundane, in the statistics of the images collected by professional observatories. A small but consistent effect emerged. When observations were synchronous, the data had more structure than when they were dispersed. This sounds normal, as synchronous observations improve quality, but the structure here wasn't simply less noise, it was of a different kind, as if the object responded to a collective gaze differently than to individual gazes, as if it knew the difference between we are looking and we are looking together. If this feeling doesn't go away, you take the final step. You ask, what if there were more such objects? We just didn't know what to look for. And so we did the most dangerous thing for our own peace of mind. We took archival radio noise recordings, old bands, old background data, and ran them through the filter of that very needle. Not everywhere, not constantly, but in short, rare bursts. The flashes coincided with the windows as past interstellar visitors passed through the distant sectors. Not proof, but reason enough to make my throat go dry again. Because then, Atlas isn't a unique oddity, then Atlas is simply the first one we've seen well enough to admit to ourselves that it's a coincidence, the first one to arrive in the era of the dense network. And this is where the scenario stops being about a comet. It becomes about us. about how we've finally become loud enough and coherent enough for someone to passively measure us. The most terrifying conclusion isn't about control or the threat, it's simpler, and that makes it worse. Atlas didn't do anything to force us to flee. It didn't hit us, didn't explode us, didn't blind us. It passed through in such a way that we remained alive and calm, but still delivered maximum signal. This doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like a calibration, a test, after which the next step isn't one more run, but a change in conditions. Tom then said a phrase I hate for its accuracy. He wasn't getting closer, he was mapping. Not a map of the sky, a map of the weaknesses in our own measurement system. And if the card is removed, the next meeting doesn't have to be nearby. It can be further away, quieter, clearer, and still hit those points where we make ourselves visible. When I was later asked if it was dangerous, I answered correctly. By all formal criteria, no. The Earth was not damaged. The orbits did not collapse. Lives were not changed. But I stopped looking at the sky as emptiness. Because emptiness doesn't return your packets to you. Emptiness doesn't breathe through your spectra and sync with your networks. Emptiness doesn't rearrange coincidences when you change your observation mode. We closed the Atlas story only because people wanted an ending, but the data didn't have one. There was a pause, and if this pause is part of the conversation, then the worst thing isn't that someone is there. The worst thing is that we've already answered, without even realizing the question was asked.